Thanks, everybody. Welcome. You were just listening to Shauna Sitinak doing qiviut, Don't Give Up. I don't think that she's playing at Rock Auk, the Indigenous Music Festival happening this weekend in Juneau, but wanted to feature some Indigenous musicians as folks trickled into the room. We've still got a few people coming in, and I might ask, ʻUnei, I think I did make you co-host. Do you mind admitting folks as they trickle in here while I get going? Thank you, sir. Kunachish ha'i adi. Thank you all for coming. I'm grateful to be here with you tonight to take part in a most powerful song, a celebration and centering of Indigenous voices and people. My name is Jonas Lamb. I work at the UAS Egan Library, and I coordinate the One Campus, One Book initiative. The program seeks to provide members of the UAS campus and community, especially first-year students, with some common ground for conversation. Through the celebration of a common work of literature, we are able to begin each year on the same page. This year, we've partnered with the Juneau Public Libraries and the NEA Big Read to celebrate Joy Harjo's An American Sunrise. And before I introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Saul Neely, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the homelands on which many of us gather tonight and to thank our sponsors. Our UAS campuses reside on the unceded territories of the Aq'awan, Tontaquan, and Qiviut on Tlingit Aaní, also known as Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka, Alaska. We acknowledge that Tlingit peoples have been stewards of the land on which we work and reside since time immemorial. And we are grateful for that stewardship and incredible care. We also recognize that our campuses are adjacent to the ancestral home of the Hadas and Tsimshian, and we commit to serving their peoples with equity and care. We recognize the series of unjust actions that attempted to remove them from their land, which includes forced relocations and the burning of villages. We honor the relationships that exist between Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples and their sovereign relationships to their lands, to their languages, their ancestors, and future generations. We aspire to work toward healing and liberation, recognizing our paths are intertwined in the complex histories of colonization in Alaska. We acknowledge that we arrived here by listening to the people's elders' lessons from the past, and these stories carry us as we weave a healthier world for future generations. I want to thank the action teams from the Alaska Native Success Initiative for their development of that land acknowledgement for our UAS campuses. Tonight's event is sponsored by the UAS One Campus, One Book program, the Juneau Public Libraries, the Friends of the Juneau Public Libraries, and is made possible in part by the NEA Big Read grants. The NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. Tonight's event is being recorded, and the archive will be posted within a week to the UAS YouTube page. We'll begin with introductory remarks by Dr. Neely, and then each poet will read from their work, respond to questions from co-panelists, and then read and reflect on a poem by Joy Harjo. We'll conclude with questions from attendees and take the last question around 8:30. Attendees are asked to please mute your mic. All attendees are encouraged to submit your questions for the panelists using the chat box. These questions will be collected and shared as time allows. When submitting your question, please indicate if you would like to be unmuted to voice your question or if you would prefer to have a moderator ask on your behalf. For those choosing to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a comment, please be respectful of others by keeping your comments brief. Anyone submitting racist or otherwise inappropriate comments will be removed from the event. Cherokee citizen and scholar Saul Neely earned his Ph.D. in philosophy and literature from Purdue University and completed Cornell University's School of Criticism and Theory. Neely is Director of Composition and Associate Professor of English at Heritage University, and he specializes in theory and cultural studies within literature and Native American studies. His recent publications include The Trail Where We Cried, Displacement and Healing Across Generations, and On Becoming Human in Tlingit Aaní, Encountering Levinas through Indigenous Inspiration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Saul Neely.
Chish. Sio nagad tueja. Chalagi gadi sole dagwadoa. Saul Neely dagwado yonega gadi. Hoa. Good evening, everyone. Yakhe yuksatini. It's good to see you all here tonight. As a citizen of the Cherokee Nation who has lived in Alaska for over 20 years, with the last 11 of those years in Tlingit Aaní, on the land of Akwan and Taku Kwan, where my daughter was born, and enjoyed the nurturing support of many peoples, especially from the Indigenous community. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today to moderate and participate in tonight's event, a most powerful song elevating Indigenous voices. We convene this evening with a group of incredible Alaskan poets who not only enjoy the respect and admiration of the multiple Alaskan communities from which they hail, but who also stay engaged in those communities, elevating Indigenous voices in the interest of decolonial justice and reparation. Although I'm currently residing in Ellensburg, Washington, and teaching at Heritage University, located on Yaakmumami Ticham, the Yakama Nation Reservation, Alaska, especially Southeast Alaska, still very much feels like home to my family. So I'm grateful to Jonas for the invitation to moderate and participate in tonight's event, both for the invitation and because I know how much work went into organizing it. And I gotta say real quickly, since the pandemic, I've given a whole lot of talks by Zoom, and this is the first one without a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm super happy about that. I'm very excited to be here as part of the panel of great talent, but I'm also excited that we convene tonight as a celebration of Joy Harjo more generally, and her book, An American Sunrise, more specifically, which is the One Campus, One Book selection this year. Now, in conversation with one another earlier this week, the panel, we identified a set of loosely related themes beyond the influence of Harjo's poetry on our own work that we wanted to address this evening, however directly or indirectly. And we sort of settled on 5 clusters of concerns: poetic lineage or poetic ancestors, poem as sacred site, increasing visibility of Indigenous poetry, culture, history, people, displacement, as well as historical violence, transgenerational trauma, memory, and the possibility of repair. And tonight, we invite you to reflect on these themes or questions throughout the evening as we hear from our talented poets and collectively meditate on how these themes intersect, diverge, and break like waves over the spirited shores of our Indigenous futures. Now, as moderator, I'll briefly open these poetic meditations to say something very briefly about why Joy Harjo's work is important to me, which is for many reasons, but I'll rest on this. I first studied Harjo's poetry when I attended Cornell School of Criticism and Theory. Although I'd known of her work, I hadn't really studied it. And I am not at all allergic to that vocabulary of study in any way, because for me to study means holding a book in your hands. And in this case, it was how we became human. Holding a book in your hands and listening, to turn and turn the text with a kind of ritual self-discipline, to rub it until it bleeds, as a rabbi once said. And what I've always loved about Harjo's work is that while it stays grounded and rooted and true to Muskogee Creek culture, it also opens into the possibility of a radical pan-tribal solidarity. And this is actually an argument that Craig Womack makes, who's also Muskogee Creek and Cherokee, in his book, Red on Red. Harjo embraces a kind of indigenous cosmopolitanism. And this feature of her work is what makes her the perfect poet laureate of the United States. And when we encounter Harjo's poetry, it is as if we are at once called to bear witness to everything that's come before us, the totality of settler colonial violence and its innumerable victims, while at the same time we are called to secure our indigenous futures. That's the calling of her poetry. Like in Grace, where she writes, "I know there is something larger than the memory of a dispossessed people. We have seen it." There is the call to bear witness, a calling that emerges from and is discernible within proximity to the ineffable. Like when she writes in Deer Dancer, "In this language, there are no words for how the real world collapses." Or in her poem Protocol, when she writes, "I do not know your language, though I hear the breaking of waves through the vowels." These are heavy words that nevertheless rise up out of the ineffable which might in the end be our most powerful song. So let me go ahead and introduce tonight's speakers. Earlier today by email, I suggested that we determine the order of tonight's poetic presentations based on geography, moving north to south. I don't know why, it seemed like some kind of reverse colonial geography to me, right? Like instead of north to the future, we're gonna decolonize going from the north to the south. So we're gonna start tonight with Marie Tozier, who is coming to us from Nome. And Marie Tozier is an Iñupiaq poet who earned an MFA from the low-residency program at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She's the author of the poetry collection Open the Dark, which illuminates elements of Iñupiaq life in northwestern Alaska. Tozier has also written for the Anchorage Daily News. She teaches at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus. As a participant in the university's Robert Wood Johnson Global Solutions Partnership, she traveled to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to study Maori education and culture. Tozier has led sewing, quilting, knitting, and qiviut processing and writing classes. And she lives in Nome, Alaska with her family. And then we will hear from ʻUnei Lance Twitchell, who is coming to us tonight from Juneau. Dr. ʻUnei Lance Twitchell is an associate professor of Alaska Native Languages at UAS. He earned his Ph.D. in Hawaiian and Indigenous Language and Culture Revitalization from the College of Hawaiian Language at the University of Hawaiʻi. He also holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a BA in English with a minor in American Indian Studies from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. He has won a number of awards and grants in the interest of Tlingit language and culture revitalization, but two of his most recent awards include receiving the first Alaskan Institute Young Native Leader Award in 2020, and even more recently, a fellowship from the Rasmussen Foundation that will allow him to realize a longtime dream, which is to write a feature film screenplay in Tlingit about how Native boarding schools systematically tried to kill Indigenous languages. And finally, we'll hear from Vivian Faith Prescott, who comes to us from Wrangell. Vivian was born and raised in Wrangell, Alaska. She lives and writes in Tlingit on the land of Qiviut in Ḳ'eijáakw, Wrangell, Alaska, at her family's fish camp. She's a member of the Pacific Sami Survey. Her children are Tāk'tēntān from the Snail House. She is adopted into the Tāk'tēntān clan. She's the author of 7 books of poetry and a collection of linked short stories. Her boudoir, My Father's Smokehouse, is forthcoming from West Margin Press. Also, a full-length poetry collection, Old Woman with Berries in Her Lap, is forthcoming from the Alaska Literary Series in February 2022. So let's talk about the format real quick. So this event will unfold in 3 movements, followed by a brief Q&A. In our first movement, each poet will read a bit from their own work while speaking to some of the shared themes or concerns we identified earlier. In this way, each poet will speak about 10 minutes, which should last about half an hour. Our second movement will be comprised of questions the poets will ask each other, some of which have been prepared in advance and some of which will be extemporaneous. That should also last about half an hour. In our third movement, each of us will read a poem by Harjo that is dear to us, and then we'll follow it up with some questions from you all and wrap up the evening. So it's a dynamic program. We won't delay anymore. And with that, will you please help me welcome to the Zoom stage, Marie Tozier.
Thank you, Saul. I just have very few introductory remarks. I'd like to spend most of my time reading some poetry. My book, Open the Dark, is mostly about sharing stories of family, and then also of my Iñupiaq culture. I'm going to get started with my first poem entitled A Quackshruck. One spring, sandhill cranes flew into sight. Having landed, they became hard to spot, their bodies and wings dirt brown, the color of dead willow leaves. That fall, the crane wife fed her husband cranberries. He balked. He made fun of the tiny morsel. At night, while he slept, she dressed his eyes in red berry pulp, staining him for life. So one of the themes that Saul touched on was making others visible, or their stories visible. And one way that I like to think about that is not only being a witness yourself, but sharing the witness of others. And for me, that means sharing the witness of family members who have passed on. And my next poem is a story that my grandfather used to share with us. This one is called Making Do. Grandfather watched in springtime as his older brothers gathered eggs. Tethered to a handmade rope, the eldest, Evans, would make his way down the rocky cliffs at Deering. He gathered tern eggs, large, blue, and speckled, carefully placed in his sack. When he was done, he'd tug at the rope. My grandfather, Daniel, was not yet ready to climb the cliffs, his footing unsure. Instead, he fashioned a long stick with a fabric pocket, reached down and swooped eggs from their nests. This next poem is also another one from my grandfather. Siblings. My grandfather tells me stories of his only sister, Elsie. She died young, giving birth to a third child. They were close. He played the accordion and she the piano. But Elsie could read music. She played in the church. This makes grandfather love her more. And in his way, when he tells of her death, he never uses that word. To him, she began to disappear. So the other sort of theme that I wanted to talk just a little bit about of Harjo's is the idea of writing about trauma for sharing trauma. And I think that it's important as a writer to read what other poets have written about trauma, because it sort of in a way makes it okay for you to write about it. And so that when people are reading all of these writers and poets, it makes it okay for them to talk about it, which I think, you know, when you're talking about things like healthcare for Indigenous people, you know, if you're talking about the IHS hospital, or if you're talking about topics like suicide, they're hard to talk about. So I think that the more that we sort of put them out there, we're giving people permission to talk about them. And yeah, okay, here we go. This next poem is about my mother. Confection. All the health books say sugar feeds the cancer. My mother returned to me in a dream, her frail lace of lashes, the sweet medicinal mother smell of her lip dew, her smile. I don't know if anyone will remember that she loved short ribs, salad with ginger sauce, baklava. Baklava so decadent, I refused to make it while she lay in her bed, unable to garner an appetite. I didn't bake it until her fight was gone. The sweet, no longer a temptation. Like a child with a tiny treasure, she bragged on her gooey, honey-smothered pastry to Millie, her home nurse. She stashed bits of delight away in the freezer. And then sort of growing on these topics of sharing, I have just a couple of poems that are what I guess we would call political poems. They're making a political statement. And again, I think the more that people write about them, especially for Indigenous people, the more that we write about them, the easier it gets to share those topics, which sometimes aren't that popular to talk about. So this next one is called For the Newly Elected School Board Member from Anywhere But Here. Welcome to the ancestral land of my people. We already know you. Bossy white woman thinks she owns the world, rules the school, wags her finger in our face, preaches love if only we'd listen. Okay. And the last poem that I'm going to read is my longest poem in this book. It's called They Tried to Teach Me History. And a few years ago, I was invited to a writing workshop in Anchorage that was held for Indigenous poets. And it was the best writing workshop. It was, there were a few Alaska Native poets. Most of them were Native American poets from the lower 48. And it was an amazing weekend because sort of along the lines of what I've shared with Joy Harjo's poetry, just being in a room with only Indigenous writers and feeling like there was this freedom to talk about things sort of helped this poem to come to be. They tried to teach me history. The parents of these Indian children are ignorant and know nothing of the value of education. John S. Ward, U.S. Indian Agent, 1886. The beginning, first steps, declaring what is, naming it. Ugruk, bearded seal. Parents, defenders. Teach a child by example, by witness. Grandfather said, when a young man comes of age, he must learn to hunt. Of, the Bible says, and Jesse begat David the king. And aren't we all the sons of Adam? Each one. These, right here, as if it was happening today. Wait, the school teacher stands up at City Hall, begs for money to do her job, then blames the parents when she fails. Indian, Alaska Native, Hopi, Dene, Inuk, the real people. Children, not vessels. We fill them up, not understanding what's useless can't be poured out. They're drowning. Are is better than were. My brother was lost and now he's gone. Ignorant. Ignorance, another word for why can't you do it my way, less the guilt. And what follows after dismissal is grief, disaster, destruction, brown faces on the street, middle of winter, waiting for bars to open. No, the difference between life and death is the difference between the truth and a lie. You can't take it back, not today, not tomorrow, forever. Nothing, everything taken away, our land, our ways, our children, gone. Abandoned kajki, sod house, returning to earth. Of, tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. Remember. The, definite, specified by circumstance, unneeding of recognition or approval or equivocation. I am. Value. What is the fair price of happiness? Can it be measured? Unacknowledged injustices are wounds left unhealed, left to fester, warm to the touch. Of songs unsung, hang in the air, no ears remain to claim them, make them listen. Education. Would it matter if I laid out the process for cutting seal, splitting the carcass, separating the blubber from the meat, which is dried in the wind and sun, butterflied open from tail to neck, meat hung till black, backbone hacked, intestines braided, to be cleaned, water run through them, water to wash away the sin of being. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie.
Koyanak, Chish Kanahui, Yukatangi Kadan, Wasa, Yuki. Gunchish Oe Ḥ'eijáakw Yizahi, Yaltakat Yuhan, Atshi Yukatangoe Uwasa, Ḳ'eijáakw, Ya poetry. Gunchish, Marie, for your beautiful words. Kanahuiach Gukiak Tkawuti. They sounded so good to my ears. And thank you all for taking the time to listen. It's a sacred thing for our people, the act of listening to someone. And I'm so happy that you folks could join us. And I'm very honored to be invited here. One of my first poetry teachers was Diane Glancy, and she was pretty hardcore. She had really high expectations, and I felt like I was very productive under her teaching. and she was Native American. This was at the University of Minnesota in the early 1990s, maybe the mid 1990s. And as I saw her, I thought, well, I think this is something I can do. And of course, the works of Joy Harjo were all over. And so thinking about my path to writing and producing and sharing poetry, Nora Dowenhauer was a huge inspiration of mine. And I used to love to sit and listen to her read poetry. And I would love to listen to her speak Tlingit. She also had high expectations of my Tlingit speaking. And so that was, that helped me tremendously. Also Ernestine Hayes, who I worked with at the University of Alaska Southeast. And as I was going into language teaching, she kept saying, don't forget to write. Are you writing? Are you doing stuff? And plenty of opportunities provided by colleagues like Princess Johnson, who invited me to apply and become a writer for the Molly of Denali show. I also did a workshop with Sherwin Bitsui. I'll claim him as a teacher, even though it was one workshop, because I think he's amazing. So I'll just get into reading. I'll probably not say much in between each particular poem. I'll just let them try and do the talking. I made a bad joke. I don't have any PowerPoint slides. It's all just talking. So, I am one to ruin the event, so I'll take credit for it. But someone else who really put me on a path to continuing to write poetry is one of my teachers and friends, Derek Burleson. I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, kind of not knowing what I was going to do with my life. I'd been working for tribes for a while, and I decided to go back to school. So I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I had just met, not too long before, Mariah, who would get married, and so we had ventured off to Fairbanks. And I said, well, I'll talk to people in linguistics, and I'll go talk to people in English. And nobody was home for linguistics. And Derek Burleson was sitting in his office, and we had this amazing conversation. And I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go hang out with him. So this poem, we traded poems years ago. And this is one that I traded with him. It's called Definition Trickster for Derek Burleson. A man asked me today, what is a trickster anyway? What is raven? A god? An angel? A prophet? I found trifle and tribune in a pocket dictionary. Began humming the tune of a trail song brought back in a sack with beaver pelts and moose meat. Drifted to a dream in which the caribou fell like wooden matches balanced upright in high winds. Waited for their screams, but in the eerie silence saw the wanton waste and the rotted meat, calves milking dead mothers. I long for a cup of coffee with my papa. Raven turns upon itself. The definition thickens like years-old oil, black with use and littered with metallic flakes that tell of a coming breakdown of wear and war and waste. The river is an odd mixture of silt and salt, blood and bourbon, scars and laughter. I drift to a dream where flames lick up to the top of my favorite carvings, the markers that show which land belongs to which clan. A young man shoots the top of his own clan marker. His face is a riddle of pockmarks where we trade smallpox for influenza, tuberculosis for meth, ceremony for distance. Standing amongst the raindrops that come incessantly in sideways patterns, I toil through the pages in hopes that the answer is there. Why raven could release fresh water, salmon, day and moonlight, and then seemingly leave us to our own disastrous methods. I let the small book fall into the river. It floats off like a canoe without a rudder, a man without wisdom, the echo of a shape that does not exist, is not carved from the soil and dripping with blood and suffering. The voice comes up from the river. The voice comes up from the river. It is distant at first, the sound of other footfalls while walking through a dense forest, a beaver pushing rocks off the shore. Definitions turn upon themselves to reveal nothing but the paint-stripped surface of an old carving, one that has survived fires and floods, its children turning upon themselves and their people. The man has been here long enough to answer his own question, beginning with a riddle of silence. I look into his eyes and see my distorted reflection. This is stillness. The river roars into my ear all the things I could say, the history of a people who have lost their way over and over again. It is a pattern, I tell him, one that comes from your mind, imitation of imitation, trying to mimic the voice of the river, pretending to be ourselves. It is a man being eaten by cancer and laughing and loving because his footprint is filled with joy and faith in the language of his paternal uncles. It is the hammer nose that carved a place for us where we are born, in the lap of our paternal aunties. It is all of this and none of this and more. It is the soft, solitary call of a raven who has lost her loved one, and she will not stop looking. It is the voice of reason in a time of pestilence. It is the voice of the spirit that left luggage and dry fish bundles in a river that fills with sustenance year in and year out. It is never too late, I tell him, to start our own definition. Tla'chanes. The kingfisher is either looking at me or away. Between dusk and twilight, the lines soften and run together. There is a knot in the tree where all my thoughts reside, a shadow in aging cottonwood, beginning to freeze even as a pretend season gives way to the thaw. The cold is coming, son, the day when I let go of your hand. I never wanted to see you this way. I never even thought about a time to release. She is walking with the ancient ones. It was all I could say to my big brother over the phone in the night. It was all I could do. Reach out to all corners of the known world. In one instance, I am a child again, protected beneath a powerful wing. The kingfisher is too far away. I think I know the shape, but my eyes fail me at this distance. Sometimes we know when we are alone, even when surrounded by love and growth, the moments turn into themselves, an eddy where the salmon used to gather. I thought at one time I had the strength. I thought at one time I knew where to go. My grandmother once dreamt of a hill. Her two sons played happily but would not look her way. Her husband's parents were with them, looking back at her. Over the distance, letting her know her time had not come. The kingfisher is gone when I look back, but why do I feel like it is in my cupped hand? Maybe I'll do two more. The old lady with all the money. This gallery is all dust and facade, planted in a town where gold rush is the center of humanity, trapping us in a place of false beginnings. There was a world that wasn't coated in snow. An old lady walks in and makes the rounds. She picks a mask up off the wall as if it were an insect, gritting rows of opercula, a shade of bluish green that has taken a lifetime of practice to perfect. It's called Warrior with a Stroke, but I don't tell her that. The mask is made of alder, dried out and on its way to anciently familiar, half its face wrinkled and sagging, pupils rolled up in a way that symbolizes visions of a world populated with spirit helpers, living dead. We are all foreigners to the familiar. Her face pulls down at the edges so much, I picture a white rat perched on her hand, scratching towards her face with its pink eyes and pink tail. It brings a plague of devices. My grandfather's grandparents are buried in the hills here. This town is a row of buildings designed to look old, Tenants hunger for the dollars of the same tourists who shop the same stores in the Caribbean winter, a traveling world of illusions that has taken over. The rush never quit, merciless in its consumption. She finally asks why these masks are so expensive. I bought one just like this in the Philippines for $5, and you expect me to pay $1,000 here? Can you tell me why? She asks, oblivious. Natives like money too, I tell her, and watch her walk out the door, taking all that she has somewhere else, where stolen lies can shake hands over bones forgotten. Huchiaya. Wishnach wishkak. Prakasha. Marie Twitchell. Those little birds go full speed into their home. Raven named them, landing through a hole. And I watched, amazed that they have such precision. You and I are just the right touch of chaos, emerging from battery and booze and drugs, creating home for these babies who are you, me, us. An Inungan man once talked about watching seabirds. They were a mass of thousands moving, impossible fast and yet never crashing into one another. The image keeps surfacing in my mind of when I first saw you picking up luggage at the Juneau airport. Maybe I watched longer than I should have, but that was you. Those birds, he said, are like a combined organism, constant motion that relies less on words and more on instinct. Watching them is meditation, an impossible fast bird cloud. The life that scratches around us sometimes leaves new scars. Those hills and valleys where I wanted to nuzzle into still call me with twists and turns that push me to oblivion. Suddenly I am among the hemlock. Their citrus breaks the surface of my taste buds, and the deepest parts of memory become filled with opportunities to create memories without trauma. These birds and their nests, I wonder about the worlds they maintain, and how I told you that this is forever, and we rise and fall like love tides. Cheesh.
Sheesh. Sheesh. I'm going to jump in real quick as moderator and apologize for the technology glitch earlier. I did want to acknowledge the beauty of Marie's words and then welcome to the Zoom stage, my good friend ʻUnei, but I could not unmute myself. So I apologize, Marie. It's important that your words are reciprocated. So I appreciate ʻUnei for stepping in and doing that. And Gunachish ʻUnei for your words that always stoke passion and inspire. And what a way to end with a love poem. So let's welcome to the stage now, Vivian Faith Prescott. So Vivian.
Thank you. I got to follow these two great poets and friends too. I'm reading to you from Wrangell, Ḳ'eijáakw. That's how we say this lovely name. And but I'm going to take you about 3,000 miles right now to Sapmi. And this is, when we're talking about poetic lineage, this is probably in the Shadow of the Midnight Sun, Contemporary Sami Prose and Poetry, edited by Harold Gaskey. This is probably one of the most well-known English language translations of Sami poetry. And Sami literature has its foundations in old oral literary legacy maintained by skillful narrators and singers. And that's a quote from Harold Gaskey. And he says, the oldest Sami poetry consists then of ʻUik texts. These texts include both short love poems, longer myths, historical tales, bits of poetry that describe people, places, animals, and fish. And if you don't know what a ʻUik is, I'd suggest you go to YouTube after this and find out. But it's a Sami traditional song chant, and they're usually either without lyrics or they have very short lyrics. And so the idea is this is the origin of poetry, or our poetry. And some of the contemporary poets and older poets who have passed on, Paulus Utsi, Ronnie Maga Lucari, Sanovi Pearson, Sigborn Skaden, Inger Marie, Aiko Arianek, Nils Holmberg, and Kirsty Palto. And you might know Nils Aslak Valkapa. He's probably one of the most well-known. He's since joined the Ancestors, but he has some similar things where you put words and poems to music, particularly jazz. So that's interesting, similar to Joy Harjo. And I was going to read you a very short poem by Paulus Utsi, and it's called The Yoik. The yoik is a sanctuary for our thoughts. Therefore, it has few spoken words. Free sounds reach farther than words. The yoik lifts our spirit, allows our thoughts to soar above the little clouds, has them as its friends in nature's beauty. And this is a translation from this book. And there are probably the most two well-known Sami American poets writing right now. My contemporaries are Gary Anderson, who's a Vietnam veteran. He's written this book, Sky Fixer, and he used this writing poetry in order to heal. And when we have one of our themes about settler colonial violence and the transgenerational trauma, Gary has written these poems, and he also has some nice translations in the back. His poems are written in Finnish, Sami, Swedish, Northern Sami, Finnish, Swedish, and Norwegian. So you'll get a really good dose of his poetry in different languages. I'll read you one of his poems called, it's a short, fairly short one, Sky Fixer Journal. It's whisper time, after daylight, before sunrise. You meditate in silence, listen for gaps in sound and thought. From this perch above Camp Creek Canyon, you imagine Chief Joseph's horses, women in blankets. Your eyes move along their route, and you realize you are not the first to cry here. Your drum speaks of images within images, journeys within journeys, metaphor within metaphor, masks of ancient secrets. Raise your Sami yoik to the spirits of prairie, of sunrise, of guides and helpers, of earth. Water, look what you have done. Welcome the seep. Absorb artifacts of layered landscapes, convergence of chronology. Not all answers yet evident. Some found in a portal in a canyon, just over the horizon. As the last echoes of drum beats rumble to the prairie, your knees weaken, breath labors. This journey's not over. Bright green sound moves through your head, music heard and seen, not scales of your A minor childhood, no longing in these hopeful chords. Then birdsong, western meadowlark, vesper sparrow. This is Gary Anderson. And another contemporary whose work, if you can follow him on Facebook, he's really kind of hilarious and also tragic, sad, funny. His poetry is all over the place, but it's really good. And he writes fiction too. And I think he's a filmmaker too. And this Ron Reiki, and his title of his book is My Ancestors Are Reindeer Herders and I'm Melting in Extinction. So he has fiction, nonfiction, poetry in here. And the one I wanted to read you is called Death and Taxonomies. In class, I mentioned my Sami roots and strangely found anti-Indigenous comments tarnishing bones. America's melting pot, immigrant culture, how cultures are kept under glass, under wraps, underground, as if buried. And a comedian on NPR asked his racial makeup, said, I don't want to answer that. Soon as you tell someone your ethnicity, they start boxing you in. Boxing, as in punches thrown. There is a cosmetology to identity, how to cover the bruises from all the domestic violence. My brother, who works at a hazmat center, says he watches the raccoons climb in and out of the biohazard bins, says he saw a deer glowing in the dark. I ask if he's kidding, and he says, there is nothing funny about America. Yes, I love those, both those poetry. And Gary Anderson and I were recently poems translated by Harold Gaske and put into Sami's magazine. It's a magazine over in Sapmi that teaches the Sami language. So they actually translated 2 of my poems and I think one of Gary's poems. So that's really cool to have my poems translated. And this one is one of my poems, the translated one. And I'm not going to read it in Sami because I'm just learning. I'll read it in English, although it does have a Sami title, a word for snow. And it's called Belgamas, Half Frozen. To my ancestors who migrated from a migratory life, and to those who stayed. That first meeting of our faint tracks, you called me out from the line drawn in water, leaving wind pressing earth, keeping it close to the deepest lake. My presence reminded you that you could have been more like us, an unfurled breath, a soul's flight of spirit. But no, you went packing, took your children, pulling the whole of life into a strange form. That day also brought you a village beneath a pocket of sky, but it slipped into the lake before your eyes, and you wondered if your mind was tricking you until the wind gave you instructions. Stay back and dream of our singing. I noticed in reading Joy Harjo's book, rereading it, that she has about at least 25 poems or references of singing and uses that as a theme throughout the whole thing. So that's kind of why I chose my heritage in Yup'ik and the idea of songs, rhythms, things like that. And this poem was also translated and it's called Survival Skills. If you wander through midsummer, believing in spirits grown old, the summer fog smoothing the sea, raven dipping his wings, hinting at ancient cracks in the world, perhaps you can silence this longing, this chanting of hollows, shift this stretching light. Perhaps you can walk to my door and take me with you. There is a crust on the snow, not strong enough for carrying humans. So I have a poetry collection coming out from University of Alaska Press, and it deals with basically the Sami American diaspora, many of the issues that we have searching for our family back in Sapmi and reconnecting with our language and the doji, the crafts, and even the poets, and being activism from over here, how we deal with that, because there's a lot of similar issues, mining, trains going through the reindeer herding area, windmills, things like that. And so we try to work, the Sami American groups here, to help people over there. But this poem here is called, it's a prose poem, it's called Unleash. We could call up a gale and gust and breeze and storm. We are children of the sun, yet rule the wind, a fibrillation of current unwound. We use old songs to claw down trees and pluck gulls from the sky. Our songs were once a secret, handwritten on drum maps, dancing in the half-light of the moon. Now I use the old songs to soothe bees, to call a soft snowfall, for calling up the wind from a scarlet evening sky, for pleas of sailor and sea. We were once shunned, and yes, hung and stoned, even burned. The rope in our hands, an ancient method to sing up the wind, untying one knot, then two, then three. For singing, they murdered us for singing. And this is basically a poem about a drum that was one of the last witch trials, and the drum was confiscated. The Noadi shaman was hung or murdered, and they have, the drum is in a museum, a Dutch museum, I believe, and recently the Sami have been working to get it back. And so stay tuned for that, because they may get it repatriated, this very sacred drum. So that's about all I have. And, you know, this contemporary poetry, Sami American, is, even though there's only a few of us, ʻUnei is also Sami. So we're going to add his book to our growing list now. So thank you.
Sheesh, Vivian, that was fantastic. And thank you for taking that opportunity to elevate Indigenous voices. That was such a delight. And we're going to start to transition here into the next part, in which each of our poets will ask a question of another poet. And we had sort of set this up where Marie would ask Lance a question, Lance would ask Vivian a question, and Vivian would ask Marie a question. So we'll get right into that. But man, I just gotta say, you all, I'm sitting here, I'm looking at the participant list, and it's I miss the community of Southeast Alaska so much. It's so good to be here, even though it's by Zoom with all of you. So this is fantastic. So Marie, would you like to start us off, or how are you feeling there?
Sure, I'm okay. Thank you to Lance and Vivian. It's really nice to hear your poetry. My question for Lance is, when you write, do you find yourself writing for your people or a general audience? Who do you write for?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it kind of depends. Sometimes when a poem arrives, it's just sort of me just sort of looking at a moment. And sometimes I'm not thinking about who it might be addressing. There certainly are times where I think it does address particular folks. Like I've written what I would consider shameful poetry, where I try and blast some folks who I think are doing stuff like racist stuff, and, you know, things that I have to deal with, and writing is one of my ways to deal with that. But then also sometimes I'm thinking about our people, or I'll write poems to my children, and those ones have a different sort of intimacy as I sort of think about, well, what kinds of things would I want them to be able to hold on to. And then in 2014, my father was alive, my mother was alive, my stepmother was alive, and one of my younger brothers was alive, and they're all gone now. And so over the past several years, I've written a lot of poems to them as a way to sort of deal with grief, because sometimes your losses in life stack up, like all in a row. And I really was lost And I have a lot of people who helped me, and a lot of people who saw me and who reached out and who were very kind. A lot of those in the language community, a lot of students. But the writing has always connected me to sort of a place where I can also deal with some emotions that I can let go of, because I think, well, I don't know how to deal with this thing, and I don't want to carry it all over the place, so I'll just put it out there. And so sometimes they have particular audiences in mind, and other times they don't. And sometimes I write kind of joke poems. Like, I don't know if they're really joke poems, but it's sort of like that lady who came in and asked about the mask. Like, that was a real thing, and that was my actual response to her. And she just turned around and walked out the door when I said natives like money too. And so sometimes I want to just sort of capture that moment. I was like, how could I capture that moment? Because it was funny, but I was mad. And that was like the beginning of my exit from the tourist industry. I still haven't composed one where there was another guy who had this. We have these things that sometimes we'd use to take people out. And we had one of those type of instruments there. And it was, he's like, is this for like opening up clamshells or something? And I was like, that's for busting skulls. And then he just put it down and left. And I thought, I got to get out of this industry. So yeah, thanks for asking. That's it depends, but then there's some too that I'll address it right to them in the poem itself. Like Derek, he was live when I wrote that poem, and so Derek Burleson, when we traded those poems, it was still dedicated to him. And for that one, I wrote it for him, and it was fun because he had this list of words that we weren't supposed to use. I think I probably used 4 or 5 of them in that poem. So I was like, haha, take that, teacher. So thank you for asking. Let's see. So I will ask Vivian a question. And I really loved hearing poems of our people. It's through my mother's, or my father's mother, the Sami side. And he's made a lot of reconnections in his life, and I look forward to making those reconnections as well. So my question for you, Vivian, is: a poet is often surrounded by the voices of other poets. In what ways do they inform your work?
Well, huge. It's my earlier influences, Joy Harjo, Beth Brandt, Sister Goodwin, Mary Tallmountain, Paula Gunn Allen, Allison Hedgecote. Some people I've made friends with on Facebook, and I think, I'm friends with Allison Hedgecote. That's so cool. But what I do is I read a lot of poetry and I sit with it for a while, and a book can take me months to read one person's book. I'm rereading Marie's, for example, again, and it took me a long time to read that collection because I read one poem maybe a day, maybe 2 poems. And what they do is make me braver. I guess sometimes I'll read a poem and think, wow, I have a similar experience, but I didn't know I could say it. I didn't know I could do that. And so I think that's mostly what they do. And then I'll come across a poet who's maybe writing a certain form, and I'm thinking about form, and I might say, wow, I want to try that, because we all borrow from one another. And I try not to take someone's like specific style or voice and make it my own kind of thing, even though we build on those kind of things as writers and poets. We do, until we find our own way of speaking or saying things. And in looking at the Sami poets, in particular Sami American poets, I noticed some similarities in themes and the things we're trying to discover and say. And so we do tend to have a similar, I don't know if it's voice or language in some of these poems. But I think subject matter, form, and mostly, like I think Marie was saying, you read other poets and you think, wow, it's okay to say that. It's okay to be brave. And some people do use your poems to open up topics and talk about things. And that's really an honor when someone does that. So anyway, that's my answer.
Great. Thank you, Vivian. And do you want to share your question then with Marie?
Well, I'm fascinated by fiber artists, I think because my sister's a fiber artist, but so when I found out Marie is a fiber artist, which she works in medium of sewing, skin sewing, knitting, and you can see in the picture, she's got sewing machines beside her. I just love that. It fits my question because I like multidisciplinary artists like ʻUnei, and it turns out Marie too. So I'm very interested in how they work their art into their craft of poetry. But for Marie, you're a fabric artist working in the mediums of sewing and knitting, among others. What skills from that sewing and knitting art practice do you use to write poetry?
Yeah, so thinking about your question, the first thing is I have written a couple of poems about sewing or about knitting, and I want to say the first time that I tried to write a poem about knitting, my professor at the time didn't like that I was spending my free time, you know, doing anything but reading or writing about poetry. But for me, I really believe that when you get stuck in your writing, if you turn your brain to something monotonous like knitting that you can do, you know, without thinking about it, you give your brain space to work out whatever issues you have in your writing. So I think that's like the biggest thing for me is knowing that if I take the time to play with, you know, with fiber, with knitting, or the thing that I've been doing a lot lately is working with qiviut, which is muskox fiber, muskox yarn, is that it will eventually help me with my writing. And then the other thing is I wrote a piece once that had to do, I don't think it might have been about sewing, but what I did was I followed like the steps that you would take in sewing. So cutting out a pattern, you know, sewing it together and then hemming. And it just gave me this space to write what I was wanting to write about, but it gave me it's like when you start to write a story or something and you don't really know how you're going to get from the beginning to the end, but you keep giving yourself these little trail markers, and you just, you know, you don't know what the end looks like, but you know what the next step looks like. And that's what I think that piece did for me, was it showed me that I could write a longer piece and just write it without a set plan. I don't know if that was a good answer or not. That's my answer. Thanks, Vivian.
That's great. This is great. This is fantastic. Good stuff. Wish we'd stay here all night. But it's just, I don't know, it's such a joy. We're about to move into the last part here, our third movement before Q&A. But man, when you are in the presence of Indigenous poets and multidisciplinary artists, as Vivian says, you can start to feel secure in our Indigenous futures. And so I think to echo our Harjo keynote, as we move into our third movement here, we'll each share a Harjo poem important to us before we go into the Q&A. And maybe we can just follow the rhythm or the cadence that we've developed so far. And I'll go first, and then we'll follow with Marie, and then ʻUnei, and then Vivian. So yeah, so I will get into this. The poem I'm going to read does come from Harjo's American Sunrise. And this book was published in mid-August 2019. I literally received this book that week. It was published. It was the week that I returned from the Trail of Tears trip with my father and my daughter. And I read this poem, How to Write a Poem in a Time of War. And you'll hear at the end of the poem why it came to mean so much to me. How to write a poem in a time of war. You can't begin just anywhere. It's a wreck. Shrapnel in the eye of a house, a row of houses. There's a rat scrambling from light with fleshy trash in its mouth. A baby strapped to its mother's back, cut loose. Soldiers crawl the city, the river, the town, the village, the bedroom, our kitchen. They eat everything or burn it. They kill what they cannot take. They rape what they cannot kill, they take. Rumors fall like rain, like bombs, like mother and father tears swallowed for restless peace. Like sunset slanting toward a moonless midnight, like a train blown free of its destination, like a seed fallen where there is no chance of trees or any place for birds to live. No, start here. Deer peer from the edge of the woods. We used to see woodpeckers the size of the sun and were greeted by chickadees with their good morning songs. We started to crook outside, slippery with dew and laughter. Ah, these smoky, sweet sunrises. We tried to pretend war wasn't going to happen, though they began building their houses all around us and demanding more. They started teaching our children their God's story, a story in which we'd always be slaves. No, not here. You can't begin here. This is memory shredded because it's impossible to hold with words. These memories were left here with the trees, the torn pocket of your daughter's hand-sewn dress, the sash, the lace, the baby's delicately beaded moccasin still connected to the foot, a young man's note of a promise to his beloved. No, this is not the best place to begin. Everyone was asleep despite the distant bombs. Terror had become the familiar stranger. Our beloved twin girls curled up in their nightgowns next to their father and me. If we begin here, none of us will make it to the end of the poem. Someone has to make it out alive, sang a grandfather to his grandson, his granddaughter, as he blew his most powerful song into the hearts of the children. There it would be hidden from the soldiers, who would take them miles, rivers, mountains from the naval cord place of the origin story. He knew one day, far day, the grandchildren would return, generations later, over slick highways constructed over old trails, through walls of laws meant to hamper or destroy, over stones bearing libraries of the winds. He sang us back to our home place from which we were stolen in these smoky green hills. Yes, begin here. All right.
Okay, thank you, Saul.
Thank you.
I'm going to read White Bear, and it's from Joy Harjo's book, She Had Some Horses. White Bear. She begins to board the flight to Albuquerque, late night, but stops in the corrugated tunnel, a space between leaving and staying, where the night sky catches. Her whole life, she has felt like a woman balancing on a wooden nickel heart, approaching herself from here to there, Tulsa or New York, with knives or cornmeal. The last flight, someone talked about how coming from Seattle, the pilot flew a circle over Mount St. Helens, She sat quiet, but had seen the eruption as the earth beginning to come apart, as in birth out of violence. She watches the yellow lights of towns below the airplane flicker, fade and fall backwards. Somewhere, she dreamed, there is the white bear, moving down from the north, motioning her paws like a long Arctic night. That kind of circle and the whole world balanced in between, carved of ebony and ice, oh so hard. The clear black nights, like her daughter's eyes, and the white bare moon, cupped like an ivory rocking cradle, tipping back. It could go either way. All darkness is open to all light.
Thank you. ʻUnei?
Sheesh. So I wrote a short dedication, so maybe a short poem for a wonderful poem. For Xiuhkatq'u, Indigenous peoples. Keep fighting the good fight, not each other. For allies, keep listening, so you will hear what to do, not from within, but with. For academia, which I love, am grateful for, and also want to burn down, all these things can be true. And for supremacists, who should know it's time to go. This poem was called The Fight. The rising sun paints the feet of night-crawling enemies, and they scatter into the burning hills. I have fought each of them. I know them by name. From before I could speak, I've used every weapon to make them retreat. Yet they return every night if I don't keep guard. They elbow through openings in faith, tear the premise of trust, and stick their shields through the doubt of smoke to challenge me. I grow tired of the heartache of every small and large war, passed from generation to generation. But it is not in me to give up. I was taught to give honor to the house of the warriors, which cannot exist without the house of the peacemakers.
Sheesh. Vivian, your turn.
I picked a poem from An American Sunrise, page 53, if anybody has the book. It's called Singing Everything. Once there were songs for everything. Songs for planting, for growing, for harvesting, for eating, getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, mind break, and war. For death, those are the heaviest songs, and they have to be pried from the earth with shovels of grief. Now we all hear are falling in love songs and falling apart after falling in love songs. The earth is leaning sideways, and a song is emerging from the floods and fires. Urgent tendrils lift toward the sun. You must be friends with silence to hear. The songs of the guardians of silence are the most powerful. They are the most rare.
It's incredible, Vivian. Thank you so much for sharing that poem, because that's the keynote I struck at the beginning, that maybe the ineffable is our most powerful song. Brilliant, brilliant. We came full circle and we didn't even plan it. Let's move into the Q&A now. Thank you for all of our brilliant poets. Thank you to the community who showed up. We did get our first question comes from Sabrina Croft, and I'll just read it here. Have the panelists or poets ever encountered resistance or censorship towards the ideas expressed in their poetry? If so, from whom, and how did you respond to it?
I'll answer that. Yeah, I think Juneau ran into the same thing where he mentioned when a mentor said, don't write about this, so, or don't use these words, so then you do. So that's what one of my favorite poems that I've ever written that's been pretty widely accepted. It was because actually Derek Burleson was my mentor too in the MFA, but he had said grandmothers are cliche and don't write about them. So I wrote grandmothers are cliche and wrote about them. So when someone tells you not to write about something, or tries to censor you, or you submit a poem and the poem is rejected because of the subject matter, you use a word, whatever it is, then just send it somewhere else. But yeah, it goes on.
Sheesh. When it comes to poetry, I don't think so. I've been in workshops before where there was sometimes a bit of an uncomfortable reception to some of the things that I would talk about, like if the concept of whiteness and white superiority, if those enter into the poem. But at the University of Minnesota, I was really inspired by this book called Stabilizing Indigenous Languages that I happened to stumble upon because somebody happened to be driving by with a big box of them and dropped them at our American Indian Student Center there. And so I wrote a paper called Stabilizing Indigenous Languages, and I turned it in. This was for an upper level English class. And I got the paper back and I got a C- on the paper. And there was no comments on it. It just said on the front page, why doesn't everybody speak English? And so for me, that was an act of institutional racism. And so I took it to it was a grad student who was grading the papers in the class. So I took it to the teacher, I took it to the dean, I took it to the head of the English department, and got the grade changed. But beyond that, was inspired by that to really fight for our languages and to try and make some systemic changes. And yeah, I don't invite censorship or attempts to silence me, but I'll certainly write poems about that if it happens.
For myself, I can't think of a time that I was censored for any of the poetry that I've written. I think for me, it was like almost self-censorship, because my experience was that, you can write those poems that are hard to write, but you don't want to give them to anybody. Like you're afraid what they're going to tell you about them. And so my goal for the last couple of years has been to be like an old Native woman. And the first poem that I read tonight, it's called a ʻUa, and that's what it means. It means old woman. And I was going to say something about Lance's poem because he had a poem about an old woman, but his wasn't as nice as mine. But my grandmother in her old age lost any sort of self-censorship that she ever had. She was a Christian woman, but she got to the point when she was older where you could walk into her house and you knew that she loved you, but she would look at you and tell you things like, man, you got fat. I could never say that to anyone, but the older I get, it's like, okay, yeah, I think I can say that to someone. Thanks.
Awesome. Self-censorship, indeed. We did have a question earlier, Vivian. Nancy Lord was asking about the if you could name the second Sami poet that you read from.
Were you Gary Anderson was one. and Ron Reiki, Riekki, is the other one. And then I read from Paulus Utsi from In the Shadow of the Midnight Sun. So I'm not sure which one, Nancy, you're referring to, but.
Thank you, Vivian. Yeah, Ron Reinke, but I wasn't sure how to spell his name.
Yeah, he's a filmmaker too, and I think you would really like his sense of humor.
Can you spell his name or type it into?
Riekki. I think that's how he spells it. And this book he has is from Apprentice House Press. And it's a mixture of prose and poetry.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see. I just received another question. If you are new to reading and listening to poetry, who do you recommend? I hope I got that question right. You know, I'll yeah, Harjo, of course. I see Vivian holding up Harjo. And you know, though, the poem that Vivian read from An American Sunrise, Singing Everything, it actually reminds me of a line. That poem reminds me of a line from Simon Ortiz, his book of poetry From Sand Creek. And he talks about, you should have seen the fools singing, summoning eternity. Right? I love that line. And Ortiz, From Sand Creek in particular, that's one of my favorite books of poetry to teach. It's one of my 2 favorite books of poetry ever. And I love to teach that one. It's really haunted. It's a haunted book of poetry. I don't know if our poets have other suggestions.
Yeah.
I think if you know your friend, whoever, or someone you're going to give poetry to introduce them to it, you got to know a little bit about maybe their personality, what they might like or not like, because there are differences. But I think Joy Harjo is a good one to start with because she's a musician, so her stuff has musicality to it. And usually people who don't, if you're not experienced with poetry, you most likely have no songs and you're singing with the radio and things like that. So you can start off with a poet that's visually, her stuff looks similar to songs too. And she doesn't have a lot of flowery words, but the way she puts them together, it's really powerful. So I think her stuff would be appropriate for someone who's just getting into poetry.
That's great. ʻUnei, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to second Simon Ortiz, Sherwin Bitsui, Nora Dowenhauer, Richard Dowenhauer. But like poetry is so incredible. And I really like what Vivian said, where you really take time to digest it. And then there's poetry all over the world. And then there's poets, and then there's moments, and to really explore like what is going on and what can someone do in a relatively short space, you know. And so that with the word, every word is going to count so much, and every word counts always in writing, but with poetry it's going to be just a moment, you know. Like I remember one time I saw Nora Dowenhauer read, and she said this poem is called Genocide, and I was like, oh. So I kind of buckle my seatbelt, right? It's like, here it comes, like this is gonna be the thing. And she said, and I'll paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, but do you have it? Okay, I think Saul is going to pull up the poem and maybe he'll read it for us. But I think it's so fun because you can be so surprised. And so this one, so you could see it on the screen, and this is Nora Marks Dowenhauer. And so she's giving a reading in Fairbanks, and then it happens so fast because it's got this big title, right? And then she says, "Picketing the Eskimo Whaling Commission. An overfed English girl stands with a sign, 'Let the whales live.'" And I about fell out of my chair.
You know, and you know what, ʻUnei, when I teach this poem, this is how I do it. I render the ink white, and then I read the poem, and then I deliver the title. And that's usually this moment where, oh, it's not working. There you go. And that's when the students just freak out. I'm so glad you brought that up. I had a student at UAS. This poem changed her life. She took one of my classes and we read this poem in class. And at the end of the semester, she said, "I don't want to be that girl." It was amazing.
Fabulous. I think another great.
Oh,
go ahead, Marie. Go ahead.
sorry. Just going to say really quickly, two poets that I really enjoyed because they sort of taught me something about writing poetry were Jane Hirschfield. I know, not Indigenous, that's okay. And Denise Levertov. Just for the way that their poetry sort of like in one little poem comes full circle with the title to the last line, and I think can teach you something about writing your own poetry.
It's a great question. And we probably have time for one more, Jonas. What are you thinking there, Jonas?
Maybe while we're waiting for the response, another thought that I had was to read some poems and then to listen to the poet. I know a couple that I think are really pretty wonderful is "We Real Cool" by Gwendolyn Brooks, because when you read it, like you have, and I usually would have students read. I was like, read it out loud. How do you think it sounds? You know, and then I would have her. Then we would watch a recording of her reading it, and it's really amazing the way that she reads it. And then I would have an interesting experience as well with reading the poetry of Langston Hughes. And then when I listened to him read, I was like, oh wow, that doesn't. I pictured it totally different in my mind. And so I think it's fun too because a poem, it's really interesting because it lives on a page, but also lives in this moment. Coming back, Nora, she called it achi yukatung, song language, you know, and it's really fun because sometimes when you're in that moment and you're hearing the poet read it, it's so much different than when you read it by yourself. But then there's this agreement or sometimes a disagreement between those two.
Excellent.
I'm sorry, Saul, I was muted there, but I think Laura Bess was just asking Marie what the second poet you mentioned was that Denise Levertov?
Yes, it was.
Yes.
And let's see, there's another. Oh, great. Liz Zacher said she had her Raven's Tail weaving class tuning into the talk tonight from Sitka. So we do have time for at least another question. If anyone wants to send one in via the chat or unmute yourself, it looks like Saul's already got a question.
Well, I just asked one. This is when it. Oh, I was muted, or did you?
I did that. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. You know, and this is the influence that Tlingit Aaní had on me the 11 years I lived there. You know, I did my PhD. A third of my dissertation was written on Joy Harjo. I came to UAS claiming, specialty in Native American literature, which I don't deny. But when I got to Tlingit Aaní, that's when I discovered, and it was primarily through the influence of my good friend Ishmael Hope, that, written poetry like this and its proximity to the oral literary tradition. And that would be the question I'd ask our poets tonight is, how has oral literary tradition influenced your written published word?
Can I jump in really quick?
Please.
So I would just like to say that quite a few of my poems come from stories that my grandparents shared with me like all of my life. And one of the reasons for writing the poems in the book was that my own children grew up with my grandparents. We were just really lucky that they lived to be, pretty old. And just as a way to remember those stories and to remember the jokes that they told, every time you saw them, yeah, definitely.
It's fantastic.
Sheesh. Well, learning Tlingit, you're really trained to do what we call and not everybody is, but some people are. And so I certainly was, from Ḳ'eijáakw, one of my great uncles, and from a number of folks who would talk about what you're supposed to do. And Nora, I remember one time, Ḳ'eijáakw Cyril George, we asked him to give a response to a keynote speech when we hosted the Alaska Native Studies Council. And it was so incredible because he couldn't hear anything by that point. His hearing was completely gone. And I realized that because I drove him home from this event, and he kept asking me questions, and I was shouting my answers as loud as I could, and he could not hear me. But we had this wonderful friend, Shteotin Kathy Reddy, who would sit beside him and type things up for him. And for this conference, actually hired someone who would just type out the entire keynote speech as it was being spoken on a laptop. And Cyril was sitting there reading it because he could not hear it. And that's what he responded to. And when he stood up, he was saying, when a person talks, it's like they put up the house posts. And when someone stands up and receives those words and responds, it's like they put the roof onto the house. And sitting like a row or two behind me was Nora Dowenhauer, and he was speaking both Tlingit and English. And she said, "It's poetry, it's poetry." She was so excited by what he was doing in that moment. And so sometimes I try to capture those things because it's an in the moment thing. And it's when you do it in Tlingit, it's supposed to be unscripted, no notes on your hands, no nothing. It's supposed to just go. And it's a real challenge to do that because sometimes you're talking at a funeral or you're helping someone with your words, and you know that these words might be the one thing that, like they say, ʻUne qiviut, our language saved us.
Geez.
I'm probably more influenced by the Tlingit culture because that's where I've lived my whole life. But in learning about the Sami culture, I am understanding the influences, cultural, the cadence, the story structure, the things that I do in my storytelling that carry over into my poetry, digressing our stories, repetition. And I too, like Marie said, I'm also writing poetry of the oral histories of my community, the Sami American community, what we've gained or lost in the old country, my father's stories, contemporary stories, lessons, things like that. So it's all kind of, it's hard to separate that, but it's all together, I guess.
Excellent. Well, this has been just a fabulous evening. I can't thank our panelists enough. I can't thank Jonas enough for letting me be a part of this. If this was an auditorium, right? Maybe we can unmute and just give our poets an applause. Or yeah, that's right. We got all the ways of applauding on Zoom. Multimodal applause. So thank you, everybody. Jonas, did you have anything that you wanted to leave us with?
No, I was just gonna thank you, Saul. You have a lot of fans in this room who are really excited to see you again and have you in our midst. We really miss you.
Yeah, ditto.
I feel so fortunate that the four of you were able to connect, even though some of you were strangers before tonight's event. And it's just so great to hear about the lineage and the influences in your work. And I'm so excited to be introduced to new poets tonight. Thank you so much, Vivian. I look forward to reading some Sami poets.
So you tell me Saul's not in his office in Sobolov right now?
With that disco light going.
It's a cruel thing to wake up from the dream.
Thank you to all our participants. We wouldn't have had a show without you. And I hope you go into the world and find more poetry. And I think Joy Harjo has a line that says, you know, if you're worried about what a poem means, when you listen to a song, do you wonder about what the song means? Just listen. Just let your heart tell you what it means. So I'm paraphrasing, but I hope you go forth and fill your lives with poetry and with Indigenous poets for sure. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's good to see you,
Thank
Bernie.
you.
Thank you.
Great seeing you, Saul.
You too.
Yeah.
Good night.
Awesome. Good night.
Oh, that's
To
that's a,
Gunas Chish.
okay. Leave.